From Brian Wilson's self-titled debut solo album of 1988, that was There's So Many. For my money, one of the best tracks on that album and a favorite of our guest today, David Beard, editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine. He joins us once again in our long-running series of examining the music of the Beach Boys. And this week, we'll take a look at the Beach Boys 30 years ago. 1988 saw the release of the group's first number one hit in over 20 years, and the kickstarting of Brian Wilson's solo career. Brian's album was a magnificent tour de force, but the recording of that album was fraught with meddling, to put it politely, from Brian's controversial psychotherapist, Dr. Eugene Landy, who, at this time, was not only controlling every aspect of Brian's music career, but also his life. This situation was dramatized wonderfully in the film Love and Mercy, which we've talked about before on the show. David Beard, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I always enjoy it.
Well, we're always glad to have you. You know, even though this is just an album and a single that we're talking about, there seems to have been a lot of activity regarding the Beach Boys during this time.
And when we say Beach Boys here, we're talking Brian. By this time, Dennis Wilson had passed away. He drowned in December of '83. So what we're talking about is Brian Wilson, Carl Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, and Bruce Johnston. And to kind of give some sort of broader perspective here, Brian had been more or less working a little bit here and there with the Beach Boys, dating back to their '85 album where he was involved. And then after that, it was more sporadic. And when Brian began work on his solo album in earnest, it was in '87. And that last thing he did, I think this is correct, was he participated in the Wipeout music video with Mike and Al and Bruce, where Carl was nowhere to be seen, and I think there's probably a reason for that.
And I don't think he's on the track either.
I don't think I've ever looked at the sessionography for that, so I couldn't just say off the top of my head. But it's a forgettable moment, for sure. And January of '87, Brian had he inducted Lieber and Stoller into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Seymour Stein was in the audience, as was Lenny Waronker from Warner Brothers, sitting at different tables, but they were both there. And Brian had done an a cappella version of a song at that occasion, and I'm trying to find it real quick, on Broadway. There we go. So that's kind of where the wheels began to turn with Seymour Stein. And everyone knew that to sign Brian, Dr. Eugene Landy was a part of that package, not in a musical capacity, just that he was a part of the scene, for lack of a better way to look at it.
Right.
And in the brand new winter edition of Endless Summer Quarterly, issue number 124, I interviewed Seymour Stein, Russ Titleman, Lenny Waronker, Andy Paley, and Mark Lynette, who engineered most of those sessions, and historian David Leaf, who wrote one of the most interesting press kits to date because it came in a loose leaf folder. So the label really got behind Brian. Seymour contacted Andy Paley. Andy went out to Los Angeles, met Seymour. They went over to Brian's house together, and Brian played Love and Mercy on the piano for them.
I was sitting in a crummy...
Seymour Stein, if you look at the catalog of artists that he's signed through the years, Elton John comes to mind, and there's a laundry list, and I want to do him justice trying to remember. But he's signed a lot of artists. What Seymour does is he finds people.
Right.
He finds them, gets them signed, and then he gets out of the way.
Right.
Seymour also hired Russ Titleman. Now, for your listeners, Russ Titleman has done extensive work in the industry as well, also on Warner Brothers, with many, 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 many artists. I think if you look up Russ Titleman's name, that's Titelman, then you're going to see his name pop up with, an overload of accolades and stuff that he was associated with that were big hits in the industry as well. But back in the 1960s, we will touch on the 60s here briefly, Russ worked with Brian in the studio on 2 tracks. One, Sherry, She Needs Me, that kind of ended up in Idol and sat around. The other, Guess I'm Dumb, recorded and performed by Glenn Campbell. So Russ worked on Love and Mercy with Brian. He worked on Melt Away. There's so many. And I believe Nighttime. So there's a little bit of politics taking place because Russ and Lenny Waronker had worked together extensively through the years at Warner Brothers. But Lenny, I will tell you, was a Beach Boys fan from long ago. Lenny's first song that he liked by the Beach Boys was 10 Little Indians. That's when he became aware of them, when he heard 10 Little Indians on the radio.
Wow.
Of all songs. I mean, anybody who can listen to 10 Little Indians and then go full bore is okay in my book. There's another element of what was going on in the late 80s for Beach Boys and Brian and Smile fans, because bootlegs were coming out by the motherload at this point of the Smile music.
Right.
And it was a great time for me, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Because I would pore over that stuff. Anything from Smile, I just could not believe this was the same group. I just still, to this day, it just boggles my mind that the guy who did Pet Sounds, the guy who did All Summer Long, the guy that did Surf and Safari, was the guy within 4 years was writing Cabanescence and Surf's Up and Vegetables and like, holy crap.
Right.
Oh my God. And so the other part of this was Andy Paley. And Andy, also a huge fan like we all are, but he had worked with Spector. So Andy had this kind of inherent built-in thing in his own musicianship and his own style that really worked well with Brian. So what happened was Lenny goes to them and he says, guys, Brian, I want you to do something similar to Smile. I want arts and crafts. I want something to be so expressive and artistic and interesting that it reminds people of that period of you. So thanks to Lenny, that got the whole ball rolling on Rio Grande.
We're talking with David Beard of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine today as we discuss the Beach Boys in 1988, and that song right there, Melt Away, is not only my favorite track on Brian's debut solo album, it's also one of my favorite Brian Wilson recordings ever. I mean, I remember hearing that in 1988, and like you said earlier about Rio Grande evoking Smile, I heard Melt Away and I thought, this is Pet Sounds. It's that same kind of feel.
Yeah, that expressive thread from I Just Wasn't Made for These Times to Till I Die to Melt Away. There's a thread there. That expression of vulnerability is there. And you're absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. The other thing here that they were battling, they being the team that were working on Brian's album, is everyone from Mark Lynette, Andy Paley, Seymour Stein, Ross Teitelman, Lenny Waronker, everyone was doing their due diligence to keep Dr. Landy out of the studio.
Right.
And the whole time that if he wasn't there, and they did eventually get him out, the surf Nazis, they called him, were there. And as a couple of guys, they would observe and call Dr. Landy and report to him what was going on. And often, Brian was recording lyrics written by Dr. Landy. Or Dr. Landy's girlfriend, and I don't know when he got married to Alexandra Morgan. So.
She was his girlfriend at the time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So she was writing lyrics. And I asked Seymour Stein, and kind of tried to pose this question to everybody, and I didn't mean it jokingly, because, I mean, if somebody is with Brian Wilson, who's a rock legend, who is as good as it gets when it comes to arrangement and composing, to say, I'm going to be writing lyrics with this guy, well, then you better have some serious street cred. And that credibility has to be more than you're his doctor. I asked David Leaf, was he a good lyricist? I mean, was he any good? And David laughed out loud. But I was asking him seriously, because why else would this guy be so set on writing lyrics with Brian other than to say, I'm writing lyrics with Brian?
Right.
What point did he wake up and make this decision? Is it the second that he got Brian the album deal, he started seeing, I can get more money if I'm a co-writer? Is that what was going on? Because Seymour Stein had something pretty clear to say to me about that, too. Can you just imagine the level of obnoxiousness and arrogance? Arrogance was the word he used. To stand there and tell me that he and Brian have formed Brains and Genius, and then said something like, Brian's the brains, to infer that Landy was the genius.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think part of why people allowed this, dating back to the Beach Boys' 85 album where they allowed Landy to be there, is because the guy saved Brian's life.
Right.
There was evidence there that, to some degree, that he was good for Brian. He got the weight down, he got Brian in great health. I mean, there was even... if somebody would do an interview with Brian, Brian would say, Gene and I have been working on this, and Gene and I are doing this, and thanks to Gene, this is happening now. So Brian was crediting Eugene Landy for his help.
Oh, I remember at the time, even though everybody more or less thought that whole situation was very weird, we accepted it because Brian said it was okay, and all the people around him were saying this was positive and healthy for him. So it was a case of, either you accepted this or you weren't a true Brian fan or something crazy like that. And when the album came out in 1988, Eugene Landy's name was all over it. And then when it was re-released some years later, his name on some of the lyrics was removed.
I think it's properly fixed to reflect the reality. I've been able to listen to extensive sessions from this period, and in listening to those sessions, I'll tell you there was some far worse versions of several songs that I can think of off the top of my head that were far worse with different lyrics. That thankfully Brian had an awareness to change.
Right.
And I think that's the best way I can put it, is because the awareness, even after I did all these interviews, and Brian did give me the foreword for the new issue.
Right.
I did talk to him briefly on the phone and asked him, a few questions in relation to the album. But it's interesting what you're saying about, we're talking about Brian in 88.
Right.
That guy, for him to be able to work in the studio and work around with musicians, to have that in the moment expression, and then the real painstaking part came. Capturing that wasn't the painstaking part. Hoping the surf Nazis weren't around when they were capturing it was one part of it, which never happened, unfortunately.
Right.
And then the other part of it was, how do we capture the essence of this? How do we keep the expression without somebody else coming in and thinking they have lyrics or an idea that's going to shift this entire expression?
Right.
And that happened a lot. But it's like you were talking about with Melt Away. That album, there's elements of that album are like a lost part of Brian's expression. There are points, there are moments on the 88 album where Brian is that guy. But if he hadn't had the team, it wouldn't be even as good as it is. I think it's your favorite solo album, right, by Brian?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the album that caused me to take that deep dive into the entire Beach Boys catalog. But I will say, as we start to segue into what was going on with the band itself here, at that time, I wasn't alone. A lot of people were taking deep dives into 60s back catalogs. There was this kind of revival of the 60s zeitgeist in the air.
Mm-hmm. There was just the Monkees. The
Monkees, absolutely,
right? In 86 with, it was just Mickey and Peter, and that was then, this is now.
Right, and then you had the Rolling Stones with the Steel Wheels tour, and they had that album, and Mixed Emotions was on the radio. That was their single.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of 60s
stuff.
Yeah.
There was a definite, increase in groups that had been around a few decades, because at that point it was a few decades. Oh, and let me not forget my favorite group from overseas, the Moody Blues. Major hit in 1986 with, Your Wildest Dreams,
Right,
which was a
yes.
nostalgic music video. It was, all of a sudden, these groups were coming back.
20th anniversary
around
of the
for decades.
Summer of Love and all that stuff, yeah.
Yes, everything just kind of aligned in just a strange, funny way. So Brian having a solo album made sense, so he was working on, most of that during 87. And then, at the same time, dating back to the aforementioned 85 album, where Brian and Landy had been in, we had worked with the Beach Boys for that album, and they had moderate success, the group did. Terry Melcher kind of came in the back door there on that album, where he started to work with the Beach Boys on the song Get You Back.
Right.
That was the only song that he worked with them on for the 85 album. Wrote it with Mike, but he didn't produce it. So what followed in 86, well, these other things are kind of beginning to happen nostalgically. The Beach Boys come out summer of 86 with this Made in the USA compilation. And
Right.
It's really where Terry Melcher and Mike Love are working closely together for the first time. They do a cover of California Dreamin' with a black and white video that is cool and retro, and it features Papa John Phillips in it as a minister of all things, Michelle Phillips, and even Roger McGinn from the Byrds,
Right.
who is playing 12-string guitar. And it's a great video, and it's a great cover. And they also do Rock and Roll a Little Rescue, which is more or less a self-autobiographical knock on themselves. But it's all tongue-in-cheek, but it's also very cool. It's great.
And Brian's on it, and Brian's singing on it,
Brian's in there, and Drew Barrymore's first music video appearance with the Beach Boys. That's the real news there. But but what this does is this establishes Terry Melcher in the Beach Boys as a collaborator of Mike Love's and as a producer. And it's a big deal, because those two songs, to me, are very relevant to the Beach Boys' career. And back in the 60s, for those who don't know, Terry Melcher, son of Doris Day, back in the 60s, he originally in a group with Bruce Johnston called Bruce and Terry. Then they did another little side project called The Rogues. But most infamously, I guess is the right way to put it, is they were the voices of some of the Ripcords hits, like Hey Little Cobra and Hot Rod USA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But Terry became the producer of the Byrds.
Yes.
Mr. Tambourine Man. Forget or remember your choice that he was Doris Day's son, because he created a name for himself, and he was good, really savvy. He knew what he wanted in the studio, and he knew how to get it. And so fast forward, here he is now doing these two songs with the Beach Boys, and they were very successful with California Dreamin'. Then there was it was a hit and miss thing. So what ends up happening is Terry says to the guys, let me just work with you guys and see if I can't find projects for you, one-offs,
right,
where we can get your music into films. Because that was the thing of the day. Get your music into a film. So what happens is the next one they come upon is, I believe the next one they came upon was Happy Endings, which was the bridge. The bridge of that song was originally called Old Friends, and it was a Bruce Johnston song that he wrote for the Marx Brothers, and that he had actually played for Groucho because he was still alive at the time.
Wow.
But that bridge ends up getting sung by Little Richard, and the song ends up going in the Whoopi Goldberg. Is that the right?
Yeah, it was called The Telephone, I think is the name.
The Telephone.
Right.
Nobody even knows that film exists. If you do, you're really hardcore Beach Boys or hardcore Whoopi Goldberg. One of the two. And in either case, I'm sorry. No, but the song is pretty enough. But that's Happy Endings to me is one of those. If you have Doris Day's, can't think of the name of her album, the one that came out a number of years ago.
Oh yes, wait, with I forget what it was called.
And Terry sings on the Happy Endings on that. Really nice. It's really nice. So they do that. They also do a song as they're getting through 87. What happens next? Terry was aware, as was Bruce, as was Al, that Papa John Phillips had done some demos. One was called Fairy Tale Girls that would later be recorded by the Beach Boys as Somewhere Near Japan.
Right.
And then Kokomo. And John had, and no one knows for sure, and by no one, I mean Terry's not here anymore. Bruce, I don't think, can speak to this, although I didn't ask him, but I don't think he can speak to it. But Mike's not sure. The amount of collaboration that took place between Papa John Phillips and Scott McKenzie, who your listeners, if they know the song, if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flour in your hair.
Right.
That's the song that he's popular for. So John and Scott wrote this started this song, and if anybody's ever listened to this original demo of Kokomo, it's quite different and does not have a chorus.
Right.
And it's much slower. In its demo shape, it doesn't hold up in terms of cranking it up or wanting to hear it or sing along. It's not like that. And Terry Melcher had enough of a vision to be able to take it to another place, making it better with the Beach Boys. And what happened next is something that I find pretty astonishing, because it's interesting to me. What I did in the fall edition, right before I did the Brian edition, I got to interview Keith Weschler. Keith was the engineer on these sessions, the California Dreamin', the Rock and Roll to the Rescue, Make It Big, which was in Troop Beverly Hills, another forgotten film.
Right.
And Kokomo, and it's interesting. Here's the story to Kokomo, and I know I've at one time or another seen the credits of who's played on it. If you go to Wikipedia and type in the Beach Boys Kokomo, you'll see this. This is an interesting thing to me, because there's a whole other thing that goes on with Kokomo, and it's usually the go-to phrase of any Brian Wilson fan. They'll say, well, Brian's not on it. And it is really who is on it that is what people should pay attention to. The drums, not live drums, program drums, okay, experimental program drums. And if you were to get the track just with the program drums all by themselves, I think you'd hear a lot of really interesting percussive things going on. They're done by Jim Keltner. Keith Weschler told me Jim would come in with a bunch of pre-recorded things that he would do that Keltner had done in his kitchen with shakers and all sorts of different things, just to kind of create this Caribbean-style recording. And then you've got Ry Cooder.
Right, yeah, and I know, yeah, heavy hitter.
Ry Cooder. Terry Melcher's producing, Ry Cooder, Jim Keltner, and Van Dyke Parks.
This is the weirdest one for me. Considering all we've heard, I mean, I love the idea that Van Dyke Parks is on this song, but I thought, historically speaking, that Van Dyke Parks and Mike would never be on the same track together. You know, if you read,
right, because of the Smile history.
Right.
But again, let's just clear a couple of things up right away. Van Dyke Parks and Mike Love are not friends. They are certainly acquaintances, and they're certainly professional acquaintances. Terry Melcher was the thread.
Right.
Terry Melcher had worked with Van Dyke Parks, and they were good friends. So for Terry to reach out to Van Dyke to say, hey, I want you to record on this song, Van Dyke is, well, of course I'll play the accordion on the song. Of course. You know, it's a Beach Boys song. So?
Right.
I'm working with Terry Melcher again. Jeff Foskett ends up playing on it. I think really he's the only Beach Boy kind of band member who gets I think that's no, Joel Peskin, who's played on some other Beach Boys recordings. He plays sax. Mike Love is so good at writing lyrics to fit a beat. You got this drum part, you know, then it's this da-da-da, da-da-da, and he picks up, and in a Smokey Joe's Cafe, Mike is thinking of Smokey Joe's Cafe, because that was an old standard that he loved as a kid. And when he got into the Beach Boys, they used to like to do that. And they even did it for the Party album, but it got left off.
Smokey Joe's Cafe.
Okay, the Smokey Joe's.
So what happens is, you know, they get this song together. It's beautifully produced. It's, again, similar to Brian's album, very 80s sounding, late 80s sounding, because it's programmed drums. And Brian, because of the circumstances that we've touched on already, who knows, and no one's ever said this, but for all we know, Dr. Landy wanted to rewrite some of the lyrics for Kokomo.
Right, but Brian wasn't, he was invited, though.
Brian was invited because they wanted him on it, because he's a Beach Boy. He was still a Beach Boy. So I don't know. I don't know the specifics, other than Brian was not on the recording. My understanding is because of Landy. What Landy said or did or prevented, I don't know. But Brian did not end up on the recording. What is interesting is Brian does end up on the recording of the Spanish version of Kokomo, on the chorus with Carl. What they did was, when they recorded the Spanish version, Carl and Audrey and Brian were the only three in the studio that day. And when I heard that from Keith Weschler, I was like, really? And he said, yep. The boys came down with their mom and sang for her, and she sat there on the couch crying.
That's incredible. No matter what the language, as soon as Carl comes in on that chorus, I mean, he just sounds incredible.
Mm-hmm. Oh, beyond doubt. You're already on board, right? It's almost like you're going on a tropical cruise. And when Carl comes in, it's like, now you're really glad you spent the money to get on the boat.
So despite the song going to number one, the fact that Brian wasn't on it, it was certainly overplayed, I'm sure, on radio at the time. And the fact that it's associated with the film Cocktail, starring Tom Cruise, and John Stamos was in the video, and the Beach Boys were appearing on Full House around this time, I think the song is unfairly dismissed as being something that it isn't. I know that I enjoyed it when I heard it. I really wasn't listening to Top 40 radio, so I didn't hear it all that often, actually, in 1988. And I certainly wasn't watching Full House. I was out on Friday nights, and I still have never seen the show, so it never made much difference to me. But I guess for people in their 30s, this is an association that they don't want or they're embarrassed by or something like that.
There's something that I don't think either you and I can speak to. I've watched Full House. My son, Ethan, because John has been so gracious to him in person, when taking him on stage for Barbara Ann and being so sweet and accommodating to Ethan, treats him like, so maybe I'm a little too close to this, but because of that, anyways, I'm bringing that up because I've watched Full House now, Fuller House, because of Ethan and that association. So I've seen Full House, and I think years ago, purposely watched the episode when the guy Mike and Bruce were on to do Forever, and then they did the Captain Video episodes, which were cheesy. But during the show, they do this neat little scene in the living room where Al goes, "Okay, everybody," and they all clap their hands together. They said, "Let's do a Beach Boy huddle." And then they come back and they all sing Kokomo, and Brian's there either mouthing to it or singing it, singing along or whatever.
Right.
It's just nice TV. It's like the Brady Bunch of the '80s. That's all it is. It's not harmful. It's wholesome, if anything. It's cheesy, I suppose so, in some ways. If you weren't the proper age demographic to enjoy it, if you're above the age of 20, you're not really going to be into it, But that's okay. Thanks to John Stamos, and this I think bears understanding. Thanks to John's efforts, you can look back, you can actually watch that episode on Hulu, or I don't know if it's on Hulu, but maybe Netflix or maybe Amazon Prime or something. You can watch that episode. And there the Beach Boys are in 1988, and they're together, and Brian's there, and it's nice. It's nice to see it.
So as we start to wrap up here, what is going on these days with Endless Summer Quarterly?
Well, we've already done 4 issues for the year. And the one that just was mailed out, the winter edition that we spoke of, the one dedicated to the Brian Wilson 1988 album. The fall edition right before that was the Kokomo, Terry Melcher, Mike Love collaborative story that took place 86 to 89 to kind of set up the template to explain, if the readers get both of these issues, they have a really great appreciation of Brian's interaction with the group and the success of not just Kokomo. Kokomo is the number 1 hit, but the fact that Brian got an album out, as we've discussed, is his own success story. It's special. It really is. What happened, though, these things were pre-planned. I had so much content, and I got all these wonderful interviews. I never dreamed going into it that I'd get Seymour Stein, Lenny Waronker. I just figured I'd get the usual suspects. And to get those guys was a really big deal to me because they and Russ Titleman, because they tell such a pivotal element of these layers of all these moving parts that became that finished album. Anybody who likes anything by the Beach Boys, whether it be the solo album or that work, even if it's not Kokomo, to understand, you really need both issues because they tell the story together. And that was, I didn't want to cram them into one edition together because one of the two stories would have been compromised. So what happened was, because I'd already pre-planned these two editions, here comes Mike's new Christmas album, and I really like it. So I'm in the midst of putting together a special, free, online, PDF, downloadable, full-color edition that'll feature interviews with Mike, his family members that are on the album, Christian Love, Amba Love, Maureen Love, his sister who plays harp on 3 of the classic songs. That's great because she shares some wonderful childhood memories about her and Mike and the Love family when they were children, and Brian Wilson. And there's also interviews with Scott Totten, who produced the 5 All Love tracks. And for the listeners, the All Love tracks are kind of Christmas classic, like Away in the Manger, Oh Holy Night, Bring a Torch, and a couple of others. It's a great new album, and I just felt like I did get a review in the Brian Winter edition of Mike's new Reason for the Season album, but I really felt to give it the... I didn't want to compromise the Brian edition because I already filled it up, so I'm doing this free online edition to share. Again, it's like a reading component. It's like a book and record. That's the way my mind works. It's going to be a reading component to go with the album. The album does not. It's available in clear splattered vinyl, which is pretty cool looking, and CD format. And it's a really, really special album. It reminds me half Carpenter's Old Fashioned Christmas, and just great pop Beach Boys, because he covered Little Saint Nick and Jingle Bell Rock, and then 3 new songs that I've never heard before. That one's a kind of a cover of a Hanson song, but it's really a good album. And so I'm creating kind of a Norman Rockwell-esque free collector's book for the fans to just... You don't even have to be a subscriber to ESQ. We'll have it up, and people can just come to the site and download it for free. So that's esquarterly.com. So that's ESQUARTERLY.com. And once you're there, you'll see a home page, and you can check it out from your mobile device, your tablet, or your desktop computer. You can get a 1-year subscription through the ESQ store. But in the meantime, head over there so you can look at these 2 editions we've talked about, the Brian and the Kokomo edition, see what those are all about. Check out the Friends edition that came out earlier this year, and then the Do It Again / Royal Philharmonic Summer edition that came out earlier this year. It's all up there on esquarterly.com.
David, thanks so much.